Kiara Kotakatawa. In this particular talk, I want to unpack the concept of colonial divide and rule. I want to explain what that concept is. Then I will go over the way in which the divide and rule strategy has been deployed by colonial powers as a strategy for maintaining colonial control across the spaces that it has colonized. So colonization as a system works through divide and rule, and I will demonstrate that. And then I will connect this to contemporary contexts where we will see, for instance, the ways in which strategies that divide Maori, separating out Maori from ethnic migrant communities, exemplifies this colonial divide and rule strategy. We will then wrap up with talking about why it is important to counter this and what are some possible ways in which we can counter divide and rule strategies, and particularly looking at decolonizing traditions and what these traditions have to offer us in terms of thinking about ways of countering divide and rule. So, divide and rule as a strategy is deployed by and has been historically deployed by colonial powers. And in this specific context, I'm talking about European colonialism. And European colonialism worked by segmenting the colonies it invaded into population groups, by categorizing these groups based upon specific traits, and then deploying these categories to inform colonial management strategies. In other words, the marking of populations into separate groups and categories was critical to the development of the knowledge necessary to identify these populations and then to direct colonial management strategies at these populations. So colonial knowledge in this sense is built upon the notion of the category, is built upon the notion of separating out colonized peoples into divisions, into segments, into groups that can then shape colonial management functions, colonial administration functions. So historically then, the architecture of colonial knowledge is based upon hierarchies that are produced in order to maintain these structures of governance. In these hierarchies, you have the colonial structure at the top, and that translates into the white European population at the top of the hierarchy, followed by different segments of the colonized population based upon the roles performed by these different segments. So some part of the colonized population is turned into the category of the bureaucratic class that would help the colonizer carry out the colonial occupation and its techniques of governance. So you therefore see entire infrastructures built around identifying this class and then educating this class on colonial techniques in order to carry out colonial management. I, as a Bengali, when I think about the colonial context of India and British colonialism in India, I have to recognize here the ways in which the British colonial system invested heavily into education in Bengal with the idea of producing that colonial administrative class that would serve the colonial apparatus. And this shaped then the production of the university and the education system as a way for upholding and perpetuating the colonial occupation. So now that we have explained the concept of category and the ways in which populations are segmented into categories in order to uphold and perpetuate colonial power and control, let's then look at the dividing part of this logic. Now, one of the things colonial populations did in terms of the colonizing process is responded to these colonizing processes through various forms of resistance. And for colonial powers, therefore, it was really critical that the colonized be subjected to surveillance, be co-opted, and at the same time be repressed through various techniques. Simultaneously, it was really important that the energy of the colonized populations be diverted in ways such that it could justify the colonizing occupation. So part of this process then was the production of division in the colonized population. So a narrative has been crafted historically in colonizing processes that frames colonized communities as being divided. You see this in the narrative of intertribal warfare, tribes fighting each other. You see this in the context of India, much of South Asia as it was occupied, in the form of the division of the population into Hindus and Muslims. This colonial management strategy of dividing the population and then placing the population in opposition to each other was critical to sustaining the colonial infrastructure. So to the extent that the colonized population could be shown as being in conflict, then colonization could be meaningfully justified, could be ethically and morally justified as a necessary force. So colonization was necessary in order to manage these intertribal relations, in order to actually bring civilization to the savages. So then the colonial apparatus in this sense works through this narrative of division, which then establishes its rule as a technique of governance, as a technique of civilization. So colonialism then projects itself as bringing civilization to the savage. The warring savages were taught the tools of democracy. So think here quite powerfully the ways in which the language of democracy then used here as a tool of pedagogy, as an instrument of learning that could help manage the warfare and the conflicts within the colonized population. So part of this process of legitimization then was the work of continually producing division. To the extent that colonizing powers could continue to reproduce division, could continue to seed division, it could justify itself as an apparatus that was necessary in order to bring about civilization, in order to bring about democracy, in order to bring about social cohesion. So, of course, what is really powerful here is the work of communicative inversion, the tremendous power of turning materiality on its head. While seeding division, the colonizer could project itself as a necessary tool for solving that division. So you produce the division, you perpetuate it, you circulate and magnify it, and then you legitimize yourself as the necessary tool to fighting the division. So the problem of division produced by colonial processes could then be solved through the colonial processes of governmentality, of administrative rule, of techniques of disciplining. What this process actually produced across colonies of Europe globally was tremendous violence. You see this within the context of the South Asian subcontinent in terms of the violence of the partition, which was organized around the division of India into Hindus and Muslims. And you saw that in the form of the riots that emerged at the point of the Indian liberation process and Indian independence, which was carried out through the division of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. And that conflict and the violence tied to that conflict then has continued to be reproduced as a category in contemporary times. So the post-colonial context of violence continues to then reproduce the divisions and work on the very divisions that were generated through and circulated through the colonial processes. So this is a critical thing to keep in mind, which is, even as we talk about post-colonial processes, decolonization processes, the seeds of hate and division that have been generated by, propped up by, and then amplified by colonialism have continued to form the architectures of violence. Now, turning this into the conversations in Aotearoa then, one of the things that in my earlier talk on campaigns targeting ethnic migrant communities, constructing Tetiriti as a source of racism, I pointed out in that analysis how that kind of targeting strategy is fundamentally based upon that colonial habit of divide and rule. And in this context, then, Tangata Whenua Maori are positioned in opposition to ethnic migrant communities. The narrative that is propped up is that Tetiriti is a source of racism, and it is a source of the absence of rights of ethnic migrant communities. And this is what I argue forms the infrastructure of white supremacy. That is, the underlying racism of white supremacy that works through divide and rule takes Tetiriti and then turns it on its head by constructing it as racist in order to perpetuate that politics of divide and rule. In my analysis, I showed how the white supremacy that targets Tetiriti is very much the same white supremacy that launches racist, hateful attacks directed at ethnic migrant communities. And it is really important to see this interplay at work, particularly so in terms of recognizing that the underlying processes of white supremacy that target Tetiriti are the same processes that frame ethnic migrants as troublesome, ethnic migrants as impure, ethnic migrants as importing savage habits that challenge Western civilization. The same logics that construct Aotearoa as an innovation of and as a gift of colonialism that erased Tetiriti in order to prop up the great benefits brought about by Western civilization here. That is, that civilizational narrative also is at work when it frames immigrants as impure, as dirty, as savage, as anti-civilizational, bringing in our undemocratic habits. So here, make note of the ways in which the language of democracy is used. So democracy, on one hand, is propped up to attack Tetiriti, framing Tetiriti as anti-democratic. On the other hand, the same language of democracy then is used to frame ethnic migrants who critique settler colonial notions as undemocratic, as savages, as uncivilized, and therefore being needed to be taught techniques of civilization, so be co-opted or be kicked out of the country. So the message to ethnic migrants is you either be co-opted into this infrastructure of the white supremacy and align with it to attack Tetiriti, or you leave the country. You have no space in Aotearoa. So it's a very particular kind of Aotearoa that this logic of democracy seeks to construct. So we should be asking, what is the idea of democracy that is being constructed in this ideology? Whose democracy is it? Who belongs here? Who has the voice here? Who does not have the voice here? So now that we have unpacked this notion of colonial divide and rule and how it works, how it is reproduced, and how what underlies it is an architecture of white supremacy, I want to wrap up by talking about techniques and strategies of decolonization. I want to talk about pedagogies of decolonization. Decolonizing movements across the world recognize that the colonizing habits of white supremacy emerge from this underlying hierarchy that seeks to divide populations. So it is against this divisiveness that decolonizing movements center ideas, values, knowledge systems of love, of aroha, of connectedness, of community, of reciprocity, and of invitation, inviting each other into spaces, recognizing the techniques of the colonizer that seek to segment and divide up the population means that we simultaneously put forth indigenous and global south knowledge systems that work on the basis of concepts of solidarity, concepts of connection, seeing the humanity in each other, recognizing the humanity in each other, inviting each other into spaces and building through those spaces the kinds of futures that are connected across communities, that are connected with land, that are connected with the ecosystem. So the decolonizing epistemology in that sense is one that is fundamentally of connection. Decolonization dismantles white supremacy by deconstructing its individualizing habits, by deconstructing its habits of segmentation and divide and rule generated through categories, and instead it calls for finding linkages, finding connections, of attaching with relationships, centering relationships as the basis for organizing the world. And decolonization in that sense is the answer to social cohesion. So even as we see ongoing attacks on decolonization that emerge from the white supremacist universe, and of course you would expect these attacks because white supremacy is invested in reproducing and magnifying itself and its power and control, its extractive industries and its privatizing logics. So you would expect these attacks. But in the backdrop of that, then, decolonization offers these beautiful ideas of connectedness, of living together, of finding ways in which we can connect with each other's voices and build infrastructures for amplifying these voices. White supremacy fundamentally is a form of extremism and needs to be recognized as a form of extremism that threatens social cohesion, that threatens unity, that threatens connectedness. And of course, in its work of disrupting and dismantling social cohesion, it puts forth various communicative tools. It constantly communicatively inverts itself so that it can present itself as a logic of unity or as a logic of social cohesion. So the very techniques that promote the division, the very techniques that attack tetherity, then prop themselves up as techniques of social cohesion or techniques of migrant inclusion, use the same kinds of logics and co-opt them to prop up the strategies of divisiveness. So to resist those techniques then, and doing that then through processes of marking decolonization struggles or the pedagogy, the teaching of decolonization as somehow divisive. So to challenge that then calls for naming the white supremacist strategies, which is what we are doing right now, for deconstructing and analyzing these white supremacist strategies. And this is why you see the kind of pushback you see against critical race theory, against decolonization theory, because the structures of white supremacy seek to erase these spaces of critical interrogation that question colonial power and control. And then decolonization is fundamentally about building the voice infrastructures for communities at the margins who bear the disproportionate burdens of these settler colonial processes. So for ethnic migrants, for instance, who come from post-colonial contexts, it is really important to listen to Maori voices, to listen to the voices of Tangata Whenua, to work alongside Tangata Whenua to co-create these voice infrastructures so that Tangata Whenua voices can be heard. And then fundamentally to educate ourselves on Te Tiriti as the foundational document here in Aotearoa. And educating ourselves on Te Tiriti then offers the basis for us to imagine different futures here in Aotearoa that are based upon love, connection, inclusiveness, kindness, and to actually then offer that as a role model for the global community. You know, one of the things that I find so inspiring about Aotearoa is the ways in which it stands as an exemplar on the global stage as a space where Te Tiriti has been foregrounded as a basis for organizing society, politics, and economics. We should think of that as a role model and learn from that, and find ways of working together in imagining these sorts of decolonizing futures across the globe, across global spaces. So decolonization is not just about figuring out ways in which we can center our own migrant cultures within this space in Aotearoa. Decolonization is much more about finding ways of connecting with Tangata Whenua as the indigenous people of this land, and then finding our place in this land through connections with Tangata Whenua, respecting Tangata Whenua, respecting the dignity of Tangata Whenua, and upholding Te Tiriti.